All right, ready to dive deep today. We're tackling something we all experience every day, probably every hour, but rarely really understand. Emotions.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
And we talk about them all the time, but what's really going on? You guys sent in some awesome stuff, expert interviews, scientific papers, even some personal stories, a whole mix.
It's going to be a good one.
I think we might even end up questioning some of those basic assumptions we all have about how emotions actually work.
Oh, for sure. I think so.
Okay, so let's start with a common one, something I think a lot of us have heard. The idea that there's a specific emotion system in the brain,
Right.
like a dedicated circuit for fear or joy or anger. Is that really how it works?
You know, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's something scientists have been trying to figure out for, I don't know how long, forever.
Yep.
But research, particularly the work of Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett, she's done some amazing work, really suggests that this idea of a single, contained emotion system is a myth. Like, for years, scientists would be looking for specific patterns in the brain that were tied to specific emotions.
Like, if you feel fear, every time you feel fear, the same part of your brain lights up.
Yeah, exactly. They thought, for example, every time someone experiences fear, there would be, a predictable set of changes in brain activity, facial expressions, all the physiological responses.
Ah, so like a fingerprint for each emotion.
Yes, that's a great way to put it, a fingerprint.
Okay.
But what Dr. Barrett and others have found is that actually those clear-cut patterns just don't exist. There's no single brain region or facial expression or bodily response that consistently and reliably signals a specific emotion. Like, it's not a one-to-one.
So you're telling me that my textbook diagrams of the brain with different areas lighting up for different emotions are wrong?
Well, not totally wrong, but definitely oversimplified.
Okay.
They might show you the areas that are generally involved in processing emotions, but they don't tell the whole story. It's a much bigger picture. And what's really interesting, and I think this is where it starts to get really fascinating, is that the same physiological changes, like, let's say, a racing heart or sweaty palms, can be associated with a whole bunch of different emotions depending on the context.
Oh, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
I mean, I've definitely felt my heart race before a big presentation. Most people would call that anxiety, I guess.
Yeah, sure.
But I've also felt that same sensation when I'm excited about something positive.
Exactly. It's not just the physical sensations themselves that determine the emotion, but how our brain interprets those sensations.
Right.
In light of our past experiences, our current goals, the situation we're in, all of that comes into play.
Interesting.
And this is really where Dr. Barrett's theory of constructed emotion comes in.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit.
Okay.
What do you mean by emotions being constructed?
So Dr. Barrett, she argues that emotions aren't simply triggered by external events or internal states. Instead, they are actively built, constructed by the brain in the moment, based on, like we were saying, a whole bunch of factors.
So it's not like, oh, something happens and then boom, you feel an emotion. It's
not a reflex, no. It's a process.
It's more complex than that.
It's like, think of your brain as this, master puzzle solver. It's constantly trying to make sense of all the incoming data from your body, the world around you, everything that's coming in.
So okay, if my heart is racing because I'm running late for a meeting, my brain might categorize that as stress. But if my heart's racing because I'm about to go on a roller coaster, it might be excitement.
Exactly. You got it.
Okay.
The brain uses those physical sensations, along with your past experiences, your cultural background, your understanding of the situation, and then it creates the category of emotion that seems to fit best, in that moment.
So it's not just a feeling, it's an active process of interpretation and categorization happening in our brain.
All the time. Yeah.
Okay. I'm starting to see how this challenges some of our common assumptions about emotions. But if our brains are constructing emotions based on so many different factors, does that mean that emotions aren't real?
That's a great question, and it's something that a lot of people ask, wait, if it's all constructed, are emotions even real?
Right.
And Dr. Barrett, she addresses this directly in her work.
Yeah.
She emphasizes that just because emotions are constructed doesn't mean they're not real or that they don't matter. Right?
Oh, great.
They're very real in the sense that they have a powerful impact on our thoughts, behaviors, relationships, everything, right?
So they're real in the way they affect us.
Absolutely.
But not real in the way that we might think of them as being hardwired responses.
Right. Not those pre-programmed things that we just, react to.
Yeah, interesting.
And I think the really cool thing is that recognizing that emotions are constructed can actually be quite empowering.
Okay.
It means that we're not just passive victims of our feelings.
Oh.
We have agency. We can learn to influence how our brains categorize and interpret those feelings,
Okay, yeah.
which ultimately influences how we respond to them.
So we have some power here.
We have some control.
Okay, I like
Yeah.
where this is going. But before we get into all that, like how we can actually influence our emotional experiences, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, this idea that there's no single facial expression or bodily response that consistently signals a specific emotion.
Right.
I remember, I don't know, probably back in like high school psychology class or something,
Yeah.
learning about those classic facial expressions, you know, for happiness, sadness, anger, fear, surprise, and disgust. Are you saying that those aren't actually universal?
You know, it's funny you say that because those are like so ingrained, right?
Yeah.
But no, research has shown they're not as universal as we once thought. Like we thought, oh, this is it. Everyone across the globe will show sadness this way.
Right, yeah.
Dr. Barrett, she did this really cool study in Papua New Guinea where she showed photos of Western facial expressions, like what we would typically associate with different emotions
Right.
to people who had limited exposure to other cultures.
Okay.
And they had a really hard time matching those expressions to the emotions that Westerners typically associate with them.
That's incredible. It really challenges this notion that facial expressions are this straightforward window into someone's emotions.
Right. I mean, it makes sense when you think about all the other factors that are involved, but
Yeah.
it's kind of wild.
Yeah.
Facial expressions are really just one piece of the puzzle, and they can be influenced by a whole range of things. Cultural norms, social context, individual differences, all of that.
So if facial expressions aren't a reliable guide to emotions, what does that mean for, like, how we interpret other people's behavior in general?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it means that we need to be a lot more mindful of the limitations of our own perceptions. Like we can't just assume that we know what someone else is feeling based on their facial expressions or even their words sometimes. We need to be curious, ask questions, be open to the possibility that their internal experience might be totally different from what we're seeing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we've debunked the myth of the emotion system, learned that facial expressions aren't as universal as we might think. We've explored this idea of emotions being constructed by the brain based on this, like, complex interplay of factors. Where do we go from here? Like, how do we apply this understanding to our own lives?
Well, that's where things start to get really interesting and honestly, I think really helpful. Now that we have a better understanding of how emotions work, we can start to explore what tools and strategies we have for influencing our own emotional experiences and just navigating the emotional landscape more effectively.
Okay, yeah, I'm ready to get into that. Let's do it. So we've established that emotions are more like these recipes that our brains create than just hardwired responses. But what exactly are those ingredients going into these recipes? And is there any way we can, like, tweak them to kind of change how things turn out?
That's a great question, and I think it gets to the heart of what's so empowering about this whole understanding of constructed emotions.
Yeah.
One of the key ingredients, as we've already touched on a bit, is our physical state.
Okay.
What Dr. Barrett calls our body budget.
Body budget. Yeah, I remember that.
Think of it kind of like a checking account, but for essential resources like, glucose, salt, oxygen, all those things your body needs to function.
Right.
And your brain's job is to constantly monitor this account.
Okay.
Make sure you have enough to meet your needs. So if you're sleep deprived or haven't eaten in a while,
Yeah.
your body budget is going to be low.
Right. So if I'm running on fumes, basically, that impacts how I'm feeling.
Exactly. And just like overdrawing your checking account can lead to financial stress, a depleted body budget can lead to what Dr. Barrett calls affective negativity.
Okay.
Basically, you might feel more irritable, anxious, or just generally down.
Right. I could definitely relate to that.
Yeah, we've all been there.
But I do have a question about this whole idea of affect. How is that different from emotion?
That's a great point because I think those terms do get used interchangeably sometimes and it can be a little confusing.
Yeah.
Affect is more like the overall mood of your system. Like it's that general sense of feeling good or bad, energized or depleted.
Okay.
Like think of it like a barometer reading, It's giving you a general sense of the atmosphere, but it's not telling you about the specific weather patterns.
Oh, okay.
So emotions, on the other hand, are those more complex constructed experiences, right? The ones we label with those specific words like fear, joy, anger, sadness, all of those.
So affect is kind of like the background music, and emotions are the melodies that play over it.
I love that. That's such a good analogy.
Okay.
Because just like the background music can really influence how we perceive the melody, whether it feels upbeat or kind of melancholy, our affect can really influence how we experience and interpret our emotions.
So if my body budget's running low, I might be more likely to experience those, like, more negative emotions, even if there isn't a specific reason for them, just because my system's depleted.
Yeah, exactly. You're already primed for it.
Okay.
Which means, and this is where it gets really helpful, taking care of your body budget can make a huge difference.
Right. So getting enough sleep, eating well, exercising, all those things we know we should be doing.
Yeah, it's not just about feeling good physically. It really impacts your emotional well-being, too.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So that's like one ingredient we can work with. But what about those specific emotions that just kind of pop up in our daily lives?
Yeah.
Like, let's say I'm driving and someone cuts me off and I just feel this surge of anger. What can I do in that moment to prevent that anger from, like, taking over?
That's such a perfect example because we've all been there.
Yeah.
Right. And it's those moments where we feel like, oh, I'm just reacting. I'm not in control. But you actually have more power than you think.
Okay, good.
One of the most powerful things, and honestly, it sounds simple, but it can be really hard to do, is to just notice the emotion as it arises without judgment.
Okay.
Like Dr. Joan Rosenberg, she gave this amazing TEDx talk on emotional mastery, and she calls it staying present with your emotions.
Okay, so instead of trying to push that anger away or ignore it, I just, like, acknowledge that it's there.
Yeah, you just let it be. And this might sound counterintuitive, but often the more we resist an emotion, the stronger it becomes.
It's like a boomerang. You try to throw it away and it comes right back at you.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. Or like trying to hold a beach ball underwater.
Yeah, right.
The more you push it down, the more forcefully it's going to pop back up.
So just let it be there, kind of like a wave passing through.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Dr. Rosenberg, she suggests that if you can stay present with that emotion, whatever it is, for just 90 seconds,
90 seconds.
it will naturally begin to dissipate.
Okay, that's not so bad. It feels manageable.
Yeah, 90 seconds you can do that.
But what if the anger is triggered by something someone else did? Like that person who cut me off in traffic. It feels hard not to blame them for my anger.
Oh,
It's their fault, right?
It's totally understandable, especially in those situations where it feels like, okay, you did something to me, now I feel this way. But here's where remembering that emotions are constructed can be so helpful. It wasn't the other driver's actions that caused your anger. It was your brain's interpretation of those actions.
Okay, I get that, but like their actions were dangerous. I mean, it's normal to feel angry about that, right?
Totally. It's normal to have an emotional reaction to events, especially ones that feel threatening or unfair. But the key is recognizing that your reaction is based on your perceptions, your beliefs, your past experiences,
right.
All of that.
So two different people could experience the same event, let's say getting cut off in traffic, and have totally different emotional reactions.
Absolutely. One person might get cut off and feel this surge of anger, like we're talking about, while another person might feel a moment of fear,
Yeah.
and then relief that they weren't hurt.
Okay, that makes sense. But how does that actually help me in the moment when I'm the one feeling angry?
Well, first of all, I think it can help you take a step back from that initial surge of anger and recognize that it's not the whole story, it's just one interpretation of the situation. And it's not necessarily the only interpretation or even the most accurate one.
So instead of getting all caught up in, like, the blame game, I can try to detach a little bit.
Yeah.
Observe the anger, like, without letting it consume me.
Exactly. And that detachment, even if it's just for a few seconds, can create space for you to choose a more skillful response.
So instead of, like, yelling at the other driver or honking my horn or whatever, I can take a few deep breaths, remind myself that it's not personal, and just move on with my day.
You got it. And that's such a great example of how understanding the constructed nature of emotions can really give us more agency.
This is starting to feel very empowering. But what about those really intense emotions like grief or trauma that feel much bigger than just 90 seconds? Is it even possible to apply these principles in those situations?
That's a great question, and it's important to acknowledge that these principles aren't a quick fix for deep emotional pain. Working through those intense emotions like grief or trauma often requires professional support
Yeah, of course.
and can be a long and complex process.
So these techniques aren't meant to replace therapy or anything like that?
Right, exactly. They can be really helpful tools, but they're not a substitute for professional help when it's needed.
Okay.
But I do think that even in those situations, understanding that emotions are constructed can offer a sense of hope and possibility. It reminds us that even though our emotions might feel so overwhelming in the moment, they're not permanent.
Right.
They're fluid, they can change, they can evolve over time.
They're not, like, stuck there forever.
Not at all.
Okay, I'm really starting to appreciate the power of this perspective shift. But I have to ask, if emotions aren't just simply triggered by events, but rather constructed by our brains, like we've been talking about, what role do our thoughts play in all of this?
Oh, that's such a great question. Because it brings us to another key ingredient in the emotion recipe, our thoughts.
So our thoughts can actually influence our emotions.
Absolutely.
Okay.
In fact, a lot of psychologists believe that our thoughts play a central role in shaping our whole emotional experience.
So it's not just what happens to us, but how we think about what happens.
You got it.
Okay.
Let's go back to that example of getting cut off in traffic, right? Imagine two different people, same experience. One person might think, that jerk, he almost caused an accident. He's a terrible driver. I can't believe he got away with that.
Right, yeah.
Those thoughts are going to fuel feelings of anger, indignation, maybe even a desire for revenge.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. So what might the other person be thinking in that same situation?
The other person, even though they experienced the same event, might have a totally different set of thoughts going through their head. They might think, wow, that was close. I'm so glad I reacted quickly and avoided an accident. I'm grateful everyone's okay, and I'm just going to take a few deep breaths to calm down before I continue driving.
Okay, so their thoughts are more focused on gratitude, relief, and like self-regulation.
Exactly. And those thoughts are going to lead to very different feelings, probably feelings of calm, maybe even a renewed sense of appreciation for their own safety, the safety of others.
So even though both people experienced the exact same event, their different thoughts led to very different emotional outcomes.
Exactly. And this is what highlights the incredible power of our thoughts in shaping our emotional landscapes.
This is pretty mind-blowing. So if we want to manage our emotions more effectively, we need to pay attention to our thoughts and try to shift them in a more positive or helpful direction.
That's the idea. And this is actually where a lot of the techniques from cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, come in.
Oh, CBT?
CBT is a type of therapy that focuses on helping people identify and change those unhelpful thought patterns that contribute to negative emotions and behaviors.
So it's like we're learning to become better editors of our own mental movies.
I love that analogy. Yeah, it's about recognizing when we're playing that same old negative reel over and over again, and then learning how to rewrite the script.
Okay, I'm really starting to see how this all fits together. So we can manage our effect by taking care of our body budget, we can learn to stay present with our emotions as they come up, and we can work on shifting our thoughts in a more helpful direction. But what about those times when we feel like we're just stuck in a negative emotional rut? Like, what if I'm feeling anxious about an upcoming presentation and I just can't seem to shake it off? Are there any other tools or strategies that we can use?
Absolutely. And this one might seem a little counterintuitive, but it's actually incredibly powerful. It's the power of movement.
Movement. What does that have to do with emotions?
Well, remember Dr. Alan Watkins' TEDx talk about the nervous system?
Yeah.
He emphasized that the whole purpose of the nervous system is to decide how to move.
Right.
Our brains are constantly processing information from our environment, from our bodies, and then figuring out, okay, how do we need to move in response to this information?
So our emotions are essentially guiding our actions.
Exactly. And that's why movement can be such a powerful tool for regulating emotions. When we engage in physical activity, we're basically sending signals to our brains that are incompatible with those negative emotions.
So if I'm feeling super anxious about a presentation, going for a run or hitting the gym or even just dancing around my living room could actually help me to feel less anxious.
It totally can.
That's good to know. It feels a lot more manageable than trying to force myself to think positive thoughts when my whole body feels tense and anxious.
Yeah, sometimes that shift in your physical state is all it takes to create a shift in your emotional state as well.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. This is making me want to get up and move right now. But before I do, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, this idea that our emotions are also influenced by our cultural background.
Right.
How does that factor into all of this?
That's such an important point, and I think it's something that we often overlook.
Yeah.
Our culture shapes everything from the language we use to describe emotions to the ways in which we're expected to express them.
Okay.
Like some cultures value emotional restraint,
Yeah.
keeping it all in, while others encourage much more open displays of emotion.
Right.
And these cultural norms can have a huge impact on how we experience and regulate our own emotions.
So what might look like emotional repression in one culture could be considered politeness or respect in another.
Exactly.
Okay, that's interesting.
And that's why it's so important to be mindful of those cultural differences when we're interacting with people from different backgrounds. We can't just assume that everyone experiences and expresses emotions in the same way that we do.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So we've explored the roles of our body budget, our thoughts, and our culture in shaping our emotional experiences. We've also learned some practical techniques for managing our affect, staying present with our emotions, and shifting our thoughts. What else should we be thinking about when it comes to navigating the emotional landscape?
Well, one final piece of the puzzle that I think is so fascinating is the role of language. Remember those examples we talked about earlier of words that exist in other languages but don't have direct equivalents in English?
Yeah, those are really interesting.
I love those examples because they highlight how language can actually shape our whole emotional experience. It can give us more nuanced ways to even label and understand what we're feeling.
Okay, so learning new words for emotions could actually help us to better understand our own feelings.
It totally can.
Interesting.
The more precise our language is, the better equipped we are to really identify and differentiate between those subtle shades of emotion.
Yeah.
And this, in turn, can help us to regulate them more effectively.
So it's like having a more detailed map of our emotional terrain.
That's a fantastic way to put it. And just like a more detailed map can help us to navigate a new city more effectively, a richer emotional vocabulary can help us to navigate that complex world of our feelings with more skill and awareness.
I love that. This is all starting to make so much sense. But I have to ask, if we can manage our own emotions so effectively, does that mean we can, control other people's emotions too?
That's a great question, and it's a really important distinction to make. While we can influence other people's emotions to some extent, we can't control them.
Okay.
Each person constructs their own emotions based on their own unique set of experiences, beliefs, perceptions, all of that.
So even if we're, using all the right techniques, saying all the right things, we can't guarantee that someone else will react in the way we want them to.
Nope, not at all. And I think that's a really important reminder, especially in relationships.
Right.
It's about respecting the other person's autonomy and recognizing that they have their own emotional world that we don't have access to.
So we can try to be understanding and supportive, but we can't, force someone to feel a certain way.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to approach relationships with a sense of empathy and compassion.
So even though we can't control other people's emotions, we can strive to understand and validate their experiences.
Precisely. And that understanding, even if we don't agree with their perspective, can be the foundation for much stronger, healthier, and more fulfilling relationships.
I love that. This has been an incredible deep dive so far. I feel like I'm starting to see emotions in a whole new light, like they're not these mysterious forces controlling me.
Yeah, you're starting to see behind the curtain a bit.
Yeah, but rather these complex constructions that I can learn to understand and influence, it's kind of amazing.
That's the key takeaway here, You have more agency than you might think.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about the body budget, the role of thoughts, the influence of culture, the power of movement, and the importance of language in shaping our emotional experiences.
Yeah.
What's the next step? How do we take all this information and actually put it into practice in our daily lives?
That's the real work, right? It's one thing to understand these concepts intellectually, but it's another to actually embody them. And I think one of the most important things we can do is to cultivate a sense of curiosity and self-compassion.
So instead of judging ourselves for having certain emotions, we can try to approach them with a sense of openness and inquiry.
Exactly.
Okay.
Instead of saying, "Oh, why am I feeling so anxious? I should be happy," we can ask ourselves, what's this anxiety trying to tell me? What need might be going unmet?
Okay.
And that includes acknowledging that emotions are complex, they're often contradictory. We might feel happy and sad at the same time or angry and scared.
Right.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
It's all part of the richness of human experience.
Okay, I'm really starting to embrace this idea of emotions as guides rather than dictators.
I love that.
But I do have a question about how all of this applies to interacting with other people. Because, I mean, if everyone's emotions are unique and constantly changing, like, how do we ever truly understand each other?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it gets to the heart of empathy.
Right.
Remember Dr. Barrett's point about how our brains are constantly predicting what's going to happen next?
Yeah.
Well, the same is true for our social
Oh.
interactions. We're always making predictions about what other people are thinking and feeling based on their facial expressions, their body language, our past experiences with them.
So we're all, like, walking around with these little prediction machines in our heads trying to make sense of each other.
That's exactly what's happening. But here's the thing. Those predictions aren't always accurate.
Right, of course.
We might misinterpret someone's facial expression, or we might project our own feelings onto them, you know?
Yeah, that happens all the time.
Yeah, and that's where those misunderstandings and conflicts can arise. So the question becomes, how do we avoid those misinterpretations? How do we become more empathetic?
Right, that's the big question.
And I think one of the keys is to remember that our predictions are always based on our own limited perspective. Just because we interpret a situation one way doesn't mean that the other person is experiencing it in the same way.
So it's important to check in with the other person and, like, ask them about their experience rather than assuming we know what they're thinking or feeling.
Exactly.
Right.
Instead of assuming, ask. Ask open-ended questions and really listen with genuine curiosity. And remember, empathy isn't about agreeing with the other person or even condoning their behavior.
Right.
It's about trying to understand their perspective,
Yeah.
even if it's completely different from your own.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. But what about those times when we're dealing with someone who's expressing their emotions in a way that feels really intense or even hurtful? Like, how do we handle those situations?
That's a really good question, and it can be really challenging, especially when we feel like we're being bombarded with someone else's strong emotions. And this is where setting boundaries becomes really important. Remember Dr. Watkins's point about taking ownership of our own emotional states?
Yeah.
We can't control how other people express their emotions, but we can control how we respond to them.
Okay.
So if someone is yelling at us, for example, we can choose to step away from the situation rather than engaging in a shouting match.
Right, get some space.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
You can also calmly and assertively communicate your boundaries. You might say something like, I understand that you're upset, but I'm not comfortable with being yelled at. Let's talk about this when we can both speak respectfully.
Okay, so it's about protecting ourselves while still acknowledging the other person's feelings.
Exactly. And remember, even in those really difficult situations, empathy can be a powerful tool. It doesn't mean condoning bad behavior, but it can help us to understand the underlying motivations driving that behavior, which can sometimes lead to more compassionate and effective communication.
This has been such a rich and insightful conversation. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of this whole, like, fascinating topic of emotions, but I think we've laid a strong foundation here.
I agree.
And hopefully given everyone listening some practical tools to start experimenting with.
That's the goal. I always say knowledge is power, but only if you use it.
So we've talked a lot about how this new understanding of emotions can help us on an individual level, but I'm wondering about the bigger picture. Like, could understanding the constructed nature of emotions actually help us improve society as a whole?
I think it has huge potential. Like, imagine a world where everyone understood that emotions aren't these fixed things, these absolutes, but are actually shaped by individual experiences, cultural backgrounds, all of that. We might approach disagreements with a lot more curiosity and a lot less judgment, you know?
Yeah, that would be incredible. But let's be real for a second. I mean, our world often feels incredibly divided, right? People are clinging to their beliefs, their emotions are running high. So how can we actually apply these ideas when we're faced with views that seem totally opposed to our own? It feels like a pretty big challenge.
Oh, it's a huge challenge. But I think that's exactly where this practice of empathy becomes so crucial. Like, instead of instantly dismissing those opposing viewpoints or getting defensive, what if we paused and genuinely tried to understand the emotions underlying those perspectives?
Okay, so trying to see the world through their eyes, even if we completely disagree with what they're seeing.
Exactly. We might still disagree, at the end of the day, but I think the act of listening, really listening with an open heart and mind, can really start to bridge those divides. We might even find common ground we didn't expect, or at the very least, foster a sense of mutual respect.
Okay, I mean, it sounds so simple in theory, but putting it into practice in those heated moments, oh, that's tough. Any tips for how to actually do that?
One thing that really helps me is remembering that all emotions, even the ones that we tend to label as negative, They actually serve a purpose.
Okay.
Like anger, for example.
Right.
Anger often signals that a boundary has been crossed, you know? So instead of judging the anger itself, what if we got curious about the unmet need it's pointing to?
So instead of saying, wow, they're totally overreacting, we ask ourselves, what might have happened to make them feel this strongly?
Yeah, exactly. And that shift in perspective can open up a whole new avenue for understanding and communication, even in the face of conflict.
This whole deep dive has been amazing. I feel like I'm seeing emotions in a whole new light. Like, they're not these good or bad things, but more like messengers, offering these valuable insights into ourselves and others.
I love that. Emotions as messengers. That's a great way to think about it. It's not about labeling them as right or wrong. It's about, okay, what information are they giving me?
Right, exactly. What are they trying to tell me?
And, you know, it makes me think of something Ed Young wrote in his book, An Immense World.
Oh yeah, great book.
He talks about the huge diversity of sensory experiences across different species, like how a bat sees the world through echolocation, a shark senses electrical fields, and a bee perceives ultraviolet light.
It's amazing, right? All those different ways of experiencing the world.
It is. And we humans, we're limited by our own senses, and we often forget that there are entire worlds of experience beyond what we can directly perceive. And, you know, it makes me wonder, are emotions kind of like our own unique sensory experiences?
That's a really interesting thought. So you're saying just like those animals with their unique senses, we're each navigating the world through a different emotional lens.
Yes. And that's why it's so important to be curious about those different lenses, those different ways of experiencing the world. We each experience emotions in a way that's shaped by our individual brains, our bodies, our life experiences, and recognizing that can foster so much more empathy and compassion, both for ourselves and for those around us.
That's a beautiful way to put it. I feel like we've gained a whole new appreciation for the complexity and the beauty of the emotional world today. So much more than just those simple explanations we usually hear.
It's been a real pleasure exploring all of this with you, and I hope our listeners feel empowered to approach their own emotions and the emotions of others with more curiosity, more kindness, more understanding.
I'm sure they do. Thank you so much for joining us for this fascinating exploration of emotions. It's been a really great deep dive. And for everyone listening, remember to embrace the immensity of the emotional world and keep those messengers talking. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a new and intriguing topic. Until then, take care.